The artificial gravity on Kepler Station had been hiccuping all morning, causing Sergeant Jake Morrison's coffee to perform impossible aerial maneuvers before splashing back into his cup. He'd given up trying to drink it normally and was now catching droplets midair like some caffeinated circus performer when the dining hall suddenly fell silent. Jake looked up from his zero-G beverage acrobatics to see what had caused the abrupt hush. The usual cacophony of a dozen species arguing about everything from trade routes to the proper pronunciation of quantum flux capacitor had vanished, replaced by the kind of silence usually reserved for funeral services or surprise tax audits. Then he saw her. She moved through the crowded space with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to being watched, her long ears, distinctly pointed like something from an ancient Earth fairy tale, catching the overhead lights as she scanned the room for an empty table. Everything else about her could have passed for human. The way she carried herself, the cut of her civilian clothes, even the slightly exasperated expression that suggested she'd been dealing with bureaucratic nonsense all morning. But the crowd was parting around her like she carried some invisible force field. A Centaurian merchant who'd been loudly hawking genuine Earth spices, only slightly radioactive, suddenly developed an urgent need to reorganize his inventory. A family of Rigelian tourists gathered their younglings with the efficiency of a military evacuation. Even the station's cleaning bots seemed to detour around her path, their sensors presumably detecting something their programming classified as avoid at all costs. Jake's enhanced olfactory implants, standard issue for soldiers who'd spent time in biohazard zones, picked up the source of the commotion. A scent unlike anything he'd encountered drifted through the recycled station air. Complex, layered, almost musical in its intensity. Most people would probably describe it as overwhelming, foreign, potentially threatening. Jake found it oddly compelling. The woman finally located an isolated table near the viewport overlooking the station's docking rings. As she sat down, the exodus intensified. A Volcaran diplomat actually climbed over his chair to reach a different exit. The dining hall's automated service droid approached her table, delivered what appeared to be a standard ration pack, then promptly announced in its cheerfully oblivious mechanical voice, "Thank you for dining with us. Please remember to report any unusual symptoms to medical within 6 hours." Jake watched her shoulders slump slightly at the droid's programming-mandated warning. She opened the ration pack with the resigned air of someone who'd heard variations of that announcement far too often. "Well," Jake muttered to himself, "at least the gravity's working normally over there." His coffee chose that moment to float upward again, as if the station's systems had heard him and decided to prove a point. The smart thing would be to follow everyone else's lead. His commanding officer, Colonel Hayes, had briefed the unit about potential biological hazards among the station's transient population. Standard protocol was observation and avoidance pending medical clearance. Jake had survived 3 separate alien plague outbreaks, 2 contamination events involving sentient fungi, and 1 particularly memorable incident where the entire Tau Ceti colony had temporarily developed the ability to read each other's minds, an experience that had cured him of ever-wanting telepathic abilities. But something about the way she sat alone, methodically eating processed protein cubes while staring out at the stars, struck him as profoundly sad. Besides, his implants weren't registering any actual danger, just difference. Jake made a decision that would probably earn him a lecture about proper contamination protocols. He grabbed his still misbehaving coffee and walked over to her table. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. "The gravity seems to be working better over here, and I'm tired of playing catch with my breakfast." She looked up, her eyes widening with surprise. They were brown, completely human except for the slight luminescence that suggested superior night vision. "You're not affected by," she stopped, studying his face. "Are you wearing a scent dampener?" "Nope. Standard issue atmospheric recycler in my collar, but that's just for filtering out toxic particles. Jake settled into the chair across from her, noting how her posture shifted from defensive to curious. I'm guessing most people don't react well to whatever's got their implants spooked. A bitter smile crossed her features. That's one way to put it. Yesterday, a maintenance worker saw me coming down corridor 7 and tried to climb inside an air vent to avoid passing me. He got stuck and had to call for emergency extraction. Jake nearly choked on his coffee, which thankfully stayed in his cup this time. Please tell me someone recorded that. The station's security footage captured the entire incident. Apparently, it's becoming quite popular among the night shift security staff. Her expression softened with what might have been amusement, though I suppose I should feel guilty about finding it funny. Hey, if you can't laugh at people voluntarily wedging themselves into air ducts, what's the point of interstellar civilization? Jake extended his hand. Sergeant Jake Morrison, recently transferred from the Outer Rim and apparently immune to whatever's making everyone else act like you're carrying a particularly contagious case of the plague. She hesitated for a moment, then took his hand. Her skin felt perfectly normal, maybe slightly warmer than average. Lyrale, cultural attaché, currently experiencing what your human bureaucrats call credential processing delays. Ah, the universal language of red tape. I once had my security clearance revoked because the computer system decided my hometown didn't exist. Took 3 weeks to convince it that yes, indeed, Detroit is a real place, not an elaborate fiction created by enemy agents. Jake leaned back in his chair, noting how she seemed to relax as their conversation continued. So what's the real story with the whole mysterious scent situation? Because honestly, it just smells like, I don't know, like something I should recognize but can't quite place. Lyrale's expression grew thoughtful. That's unusual. Most people describe it as aggressively unpleasant. The station's medical officer filed a report recommending I be quarantined until they can determine if it's some kind of biological weapon. A biological weapon that makes people want to hide in air conditioning vents. That's either the most ineffective military strategy ever devised or the most brilliant. Jake grinned. Though I have to admit, if I were designing a non-lethal crowd control method, makes everyone desperately want to be somewhere else, would definitely be on the list. For the first time since he'd sat down, Lyrale actually laughed. A genuine sound that somehow made the sterile dining hall feel less like a government facility and more like a place where people actually lived. You know, you might be the first person in 6 months to make me laugh about this situation, instead of just feeling sorry for myself. Well, Jake said, raising his finally cooperative coffee cup in a mock toast, here's to finding the absurd in the impossible. It's pretty much the only way to stay sane in this job. As if summoned by his words, the station's intercom crackled to life with the voice of the duty officer. Attention all personnel. Due to a minor malfunction in the artificial gravity systems, please secure all loose beverages. We apologize for any inconvenience and remind everyone that filing complaints about flying coffee is not covered under standard insurance policies. Jake and Lyrale looked at each other and started laughing. Jake found himself taking increasingly creative routes through the station corridors, all of which seemed to mysteriously lead past the hydroponics bay. He told himself it was because the artificial gravity worked better in that section, which was technically true, though it had nothing to do with his sudden interest in agricultural pursuits. Morrison, you've requested access to the hydroponics bay 6 times this week, Corporal Davies mentioned while they were running diagnostics on the defense grid. Planning to take up farming. Just checking on the, oxygen production efficiency, Jake replied, trying to sound official while simultaneously wondering if that was actually a real thing people checked on. Right. And I suppose your sudden expertise in atmospheric cultivation has nothing to do with the alien woman who spends half her time there. Jake's plasma scanner chose that moment to emit a sound like a dying whale, which seemed appropriate given the circumstances. The scanner's malfunctioning again. That's because you're pointing it at the wall, genius. The truth was, Jake had discovered that Lyreley maintained a small garden in the far corner of the hydroponics bay, tucked between the tomato vines, and what the station botanist cheerfully called experimental lettuce that may or may not be sentient. Her plants were unlike anything in the standard agricultural database: silvery leaves that seemed to shimmer with their own light, flowers that changed color based on the ambient temperature, and one particularly impressive specimen that appeared to be humming softly to itself. The Zelanian harmonics, Lyreley explained when he finally worked up the courage to ask. They're traditionally grown in meditation gardens. The frequency they produce is supposed to promote mental clarity and emotional balance. Does it work? Jake asked, noting that the plant's humming had shifted to a lower, more soothing tone since he'd approached. For most Valorians, yes, though I suspect they might have different effects on other species. She gestured to a nearby tomato plant that had grown significantly larger than its neighbors. The earth plants seemed to enjoy the music. Jake was about to respond when his communicator crackled with Colonel Hayes' voice. "Morrison, report to my office immediately, and bring that atmospheric analysis you've been working on." "What atmospheric analysis?" Jake whispered to himself, then louder, "On my way, Colonel." Lyreley raised an eyebrow. "Atmospheric analysis?" It seemed more professional than "I've been hanging around the plants because I like talking to you," Jake admitted, feeling his face warm. "Though now I actually need to produce one." "The oxygen levels in Sector 7 are consistently 2–3% higher than station average," Lyreley offered helpfully. "The humidity maintains optimal range even during peak usage hours, and the air circulation prevents the buildup of carbon dioxide that's been causing problems in the residential quarters." Jake stared at her. "How do you know all that?" "I spend a lot of time here. When everyone else avoids you, you notice things like atmospheric readings." She smiled, but there was something sad in her expression. "Also, I may have hacked into the environmental monitoring system. Don't tell your colonel." "You hacked into?" Jake shook his head. "Never mind, I don't want to know. Can you send me those readings?" "Already done. Check your personal data pad." Colonel Hayes was waiting for him with the expression of someone who'd been reviewing personnel files and discovering unwelcome surprises. "Morrison, sit down. We need to discuss your recent activities." If this is about the plasma scanner incident, Davies was standing too close to. "It's not about the scanner." Hayes leaned back in her chair, studying him. "It's about your repeated visits to the hydroponics bay, and your apparent fascination with our unusual diplomatic guest." Jake had served under enough commanding officers to recognize when honesty was the only viable strategy. "Colonel, I'm not sure what you've heard, but I've heard that you're the only person on this station who doesn't run away when she walks into a room. Medical is calling it an anomaly. Intelligence is calling it a security risk. I'm calling it interesting." Hayes pulled up a holographic display showing station movement patterns. "Look at this. Every time she enters a public area, foot traffic drops by 60%. Merchants close their stalls. The mess hall empties. But you," she highlighted Jake's movement pattern in green, "you seek her out. She's not dangerous, Colonel. Whatever's causing the reactions, it's not harmful." "How can you be sure?" Jake considered his answer carefully. "Because I've been exposed to it more than anyone else on the station, and the only side effect I've experienced is enjoying her company." Hayes was quiet for a long moment, then surprised him by laughing. "Morrison, in 20 years of military service, I've learned to trust a soldier's instincts about potential threats. If your gut says she's safe, I'm inclined to believe you." She paused. "Though I have to ask, are you sure your judgment isn't being influenced by other factors?" "Other factors?" "She's an attractive woman, Jake, and you've been stationed in all-male outposts for the last 3 years." Jake felt his face burning again. "Colonel, I can honestly say that her appearance is not the primary factor in my assessment." "What is the primary factor?" "Yesterday, she helped me fix a malfunctioning air recycler in Corridor 12. She knew more about the system than half our engineering staff. Then she made a joke about how the recycler's wheezing sounded like her grandfather snoring, and I realized she's probably the funniest person I've talked to since being stationed here." Jake met Hayes' eyes. "I like her company because she's smart, funny, and doesn't treat me like I'm an idiot for asking questions about alien technology." Hayes nodded slowly. "Fair enough. But Morrison, I need you to understand something. Medical doesn't know what we're dealing with. This scent she produces, it's not in any of our databases. For all we know, it could be affecting your judgment in ways you're not aware of." "Respectfully, Colonel, if it were affecting my judgment, wouldn't I be exhibiting the same avoidance behavior as everyone else? If this were some kind of mind control or chemical influence, why would it work differently on me?" "That," Hayes said, "is exactly what worries me, and exactly why I'm not ordering you to stay away from her." She stood up, signaling the end of their conversation. "Keep me informed, Sergeant. And Morrison." "Yes, Colonel." "Next time you need atmospheric readings for a fake report, try making them up. The ones you submitted were too accurate. Made it obvious you had help from someone with serious technical knowledge." Jake left the colonel's office with the distinct feeling that he'd just been given permission to do exactly what he wanted to do anyway, which in his experience usually meant he was about to get himself into serious trouble. His communicator buzzed with a message from Lyreley. "The harmonics are particularly musical today. They seem to enjoy having visitors." Jake smiled and changed direction toward the hydroponics bay, wondering when he'd started thinking of a corner of the station's agricultural section as the place he most wanted to be. When he arrived, he found Lyreley carefully adjusting the Jake considered the question seriously. "I don't think so. I feel like myself. I'm making conscious choices. The only thing that's changed is that I look forward to these conversations more than anything else in my day." "That could be considered a form of influence," she said quietly. "Or it could be called friendship," Jake replied. "Though I have to admit the timing is suspicious." "How so?" "I've been stationed on 17 different outposts, and I've never once voluntarily spent time in a hydroponics bay." He gestured at the thriving garden around them. "Now I'm considering putting in for a transfer to the agricultural division." Lyreley laughed, the sound harmonizing oddly with the humming plants. "I think that might be the influence of good company rather than anything more mysterious." "Here's hoping," Jake said, settling into what had become his usual spot among the singing flowers. "Though if I start requesting assignments to farming colonies, you'll know something's seriously wrong." The explosion in Docking Bay 7 announced itself with the kind of polite rumble that suggested something expensive had just become very expensive debris. Jake was halfway through explaining to Lyreley why Earth roses couldn't possibly cross-pollinate with Valorian harmonics when the station's emergency lights bathed the hydroponics bay in pulsing red. "All personnel report to emergency stations," the station's AI announced in its perpetually cheerful voice. "We are experiencing a minor catastrophic event. Please remain calm and remember that panic is inefficient." "Minor catastrophic," Jake muttered, checking his sidearm. "That's like being slightly pregnant." Lyreley was already moving toward the exit. "The explosion was in Bay 7. That's where the merchant vessel Prosperity's Dream was docked." "How do you know that?" "I've been monitoring ship movements. When you're stuck on a station indefinitely, you learn the schedule of everything that comes and goes." She paused at the hydroponics bay entrance, where they could see crowds of people hurrying through the corridors in various states of organization. "Also, the Prosperity's Dream has been flagged by Port Authority 3 times for carrying undeclared cargo." Jake's communicator crackled. "All military personnel to emergency stations." "This is not a drill. though frankly it's not particularly exciting either. That's Corporal Davies, Jake explained. He's been handling emergency communications since the regular guy developed a nervous condition. They joined the flow of people moving toward the emergency assembly areas, but something was wrong with the crowd dynamics. Instead of the usual organized chaos of a station drill, people were moving erratically, clustering in strange groups, and Jake could hear raised voices echoing from multiple directions. "Is it just me, or is everyone acting weird?" Lyreley asked, watching a group of Centaurian traders who appeared to be having a heated argument about whether the color blue was a government conspiracy. "Definitely weird. And getting weirder." Jake pointed to where a maintenance crew was huddled together, staring suspiciously at a perfectly normal wall panel. "That's not typical emergency behavior." The station's intercom crackled again. "Attention all personnel. Due to an atmospheric contamination event, please report any unusual thoughts, paranoid ideation, or sudden urges to reorganize your living quarters. Medical teams are standing by with sedatives and filing cabinets." "Filing cabinets?" Lyreley raised an eyebrow. "Don't ask. Our medical officer has some unusual theories about emergency preparedness." They reached the nearest emergency station, where Colonel Hayes was trying to maintain order among a crowd that seemed to be developing increasingly creative theories about what was happening. Jake overheard conversations ranging from alien invasion disguised as an industrial accident to "this is clearly a plot by the food service contractors to distract us from the fact that Tuesday's meatloaf was definitely not beef." "Morrison." Hayes spotted them through the crowd. "Thank God, I need someone who's thinking clearly. Most of my staff is convinced the explosion was caused by sentient cargo containers staging a rebellion." "What actually happened?" Jake asked, noting that Hayes seemed to be one of the few people maintaining anything resembling normal behavior. "Merchant vessel carrying neural enhancement stimulants had a containment failure. The cargo hold breached and vented into the station's atmospheric system. Everyone's experiencing varying degrees of paranoia, hypervigilance, and what the medical team is calling aggressive pattern recognition. Which means that people are seeing conspiracies everywhere. The good news is that neural enhancers aren't toxic. The bad news is that they make everyone extremely suspicious and convinced that everything around them has hidden meaning." Hayes looked around at the crowd, which was now debating whether the emergency lighting was actually a coded message. "We need to evacuate affected areas to the secure sections where the air hasn't been contaminated." "How many people are we talking about?" Lyreley asked. Hayes blinked, seeming to notice her for the first time. "You're the Valorian attaché. Why aren't you affected? Everyone else in this section is showing symptoms." Jake looked around and realized she was right. The crowd was buzzing with paranoid energy, but Lyreley seemed perfectly calm. Maybe Valorian physiology processes the stimulants differently. "Or maybe," Lyreley said quietly, "I'm used to having my neurochemistry affected by airborne substances." Before Jake could ask what she meant by that, the crowd's agitation reached a new level as someone spotted a maintenance droid and became convinced it was recording their conversations for the shadow government that controls the food replicators. "We need to move these people to the secure sections before they start a riot," Hayes decided. "Morrison, you and the attaché help guide them toward Corridor 12. The atmospheric scrubbers are working overtime there." Moving a crowd of paranoid people turned out to be like herding cats who were convinced the other cats were government agents. Jake found himself mediating disputes about whether the corridor markings were secret symbols, and explaining repeatedly that no, the artificial gravity was not being manipulated to influence their thoughts. "This is actually kind of fascinating from an anthropological perspective," Lyreley commented, as they guided a group of increasingly suspicious civilians. "Neural enhancers basically amplify existing cognitive patterns. So whatever people were already slightly paranoid about becomes their primary focus. Great. So we're dealing with everyone's existing neuroses turned up to 11. Exactly, though it's interesting that you're not affected either. Jake considered this. Military conditioning maybe. We're trained to function under chemical stress. Maybe, or maybe it's something else. Lyreley helped redirect a family who'd become convinced that the evacuation route was leading them into a trap. Jake, there's something I should probably tell you about the scent everyone finds so off-putting. Now seems like an odd time for explanations. Actually, it's the perfect time. She paused as they reached the checkpoint to the secure corridor. The scent isn't random. It's a biological marker. In Valorian culture, it indicates genetic compatibility for life bonding. Jake nearly tripped over a cleaning droid that someone had decorated with tinfoil to block its scanning capabilities. Come again. The scent is produced by less than 1% of our population. It's designed to identify potential mates whose genetic and psychological profiles create perfect compatibility. Lyreley's voice was carefully neutral. Most species experience it as overwhelmingly unpleasant because they're incompatible. But the rare individual who finds it attractive represents a potential soulmate, Jake finished, pieces clicking into place in his mind. That's why you asked if I was wearing a scent dampener, and why medical can't classify it as dangerous, and why you might not be affected by the neural enhancers. Compatibility bonding includes neurochemical synchronization. Your brain chemistry is already adapting to complement mine. Jake processed this information while helping Colonel Hayes convince a group of engineers that the station's computer wasn't plotting against them. So when I said I felt like I should recognize your scent, you were recognizing genetic compatibility. Your brain was telling you that my neurochemical signature matched something it was looking for. And the reason I keep finding excuses to spend time with you isn't just that you're good company. It might be both, Lyreley said. Biology and genuine compatibility aren't mutually exclusive. The crowd around them was finally settling down as they reached the clean air sections. Jake watched people's paranoid agitation gradually fade as the neural enhancers cleared from their systems. So, he said eventually, what happens now? Do we pretend we didn't have this conversation? Or do we talk about the fact that apparently the universe has a sense of humor about matchmaking? Lyreley smiled, and for the first time since he'd known her, it reached her eyes completely. Well, we could start by admitting that the hydroponics bay visits weren't really about atmospheric readings. And that I've been looking forward to seeing you every day since we met. And that maybe, she said, being chemically predisposed to like each other isn't the worst foundation for a relationship. Jake laughed, surprising himself. You know, 3 hours ago my biggest worry was whether Colonel Hayes suspected I was faking those atmospheric reports. Now I'm apparently dealing with interspecies biological bonding, and the revelation that my love life is being managed by evolutionary chemistry. How do you feel about that? Jake looked around at the chaos they just helped resolve, then back at Lyreley's hopeful expression. Honestly, after today, it's probably the most normal thing that's happened to me. The station's intercom crackled one more time. All clear. The emergency has been resolved. Please report any lingering paranoia to medical, and remember that the food service contractors are not, in fact, part of an intergalactic conspiracy. Probably, Lyreley laughed. Davies again, Jake explained. I think the neural enhancers might have affected him more than he's admitting. The morning after the neural enhancer incident, Jake discovered that his transfer orders had finally arrived, 3 different versions of them, each more confusing than the last. According to his data pad, he was simultaneously being reassigned to Deep Space Reconnaissance, Alien Botanical Specialist, and something called Chief Morale Officer for Sentient Crystals, which he was fairly certain wasn't a real position. The computer system got contaminated along with everything else. Colonel Hayes explained when he brought the conflicting orders to her attention. It's been generating random assignments all night. Yesterday it tried to promote Corporal Davies to Admiral of the Custodial Fleet. Is Admiral of the Custodial Fleet a real rank? Not until Davies convinced the system it should be. Hayes pulled up her display, showing a bewildering array of bureaucratic chaos. The good news is that none of these orders are actually valid until the system gets purged and reset. The bad news is that might take weeks. Jake looked at the transfer orders again, noting that all three would take him to different sectors of the galaxy. Colonel, can I ask you something? Shoot. If these orders were legitimate, would you approve them? Hayes leaned back in her chair, studying him with the expression of someone who'd been expecting this conversation. Jake, you're a good soldier. You follow orders, you think on your feet, and you've never given me cause to doubt your judgment. If you want to transfer, I'll approve it. That's not what I asked. No, it's not. Hayes was quiet for a moment. You want to know if I think you should stay. I want to know if staying is the right choice, or if I'm making it for the wrong reasons. What do you think the wrong reasons would be? Jake considered his answer carefully. Staying because of biological compatibility, making a life decision based on evolutionary chemistry instead of actual choice. And what would be the right reasons? Staying because I want to. Because I've found someone whose company I enjoy, whose mind I respect, and whose presence makes this place feel less like a duty assignment and more like somewhere I actually want to be. Hayes nodded. Jake, I'm going to tell you something I probably shouldn't. 3 days ago, I received a priority message from Command requesting your immediate transfer to the Outer Rim. High security assignment, significant career advancement, exactly the kind of posting that would set you up for promotion to lieutenant. Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach, and you didn't process it. I told them you were involved in a critical diplomatic situation that required your continued presence, which isn't technically a lie. Hayes smiled. The Valorian attaché's situation has been causing significant operational disruptions. Having someone who can interact with her normally is genuinely valuable from an administrative perspective. You bought me time. I bought you a choice. The real transfer orders will come through eventually, and when they do, you'll have to decide what matters more, career advancement or personal happiness. Hayes stood up, signaling the end of their conversation. But Jake, in my experience, the best soldiers are the ones who know what they're fighting for, and lately you seem like someone who's figured that out. Jake left the colonel's office with his head spinning and walked directly to the hydroponics bay, where he found Lyrelay tending to her harmonics. The plants seemed unusually vocal today, their humming creating complex harmonies that shifted and evolved as he approached. They like you, Lyrelay said without looking up from the nutrient mixture she was preparing. The frequency changes when you're here, more complex, more hopeful, I suppose. Lyrelay, we need to talk about what happens next. She straightened, her expression growing serious. Your transfer orders came through. 3 conflicting versions, none of which are currently valid due to system contamination. But Hayes says the real ones will arrive eventually. Jake sat down among the singing plants, noting how their music seemed to respond to his emotional state. She also mentioned that staying here isn't exactly career advancement. And I'm not exactly a normal relationship prospect, Lyrelay added quietly. A cultural attaché with no current assignment, stranded on a station indefinitely, whose presence causes most people to flee in terror. When you put it like that, it sounds like a perfectly reasonable basis for a life-changing decision. Lyrelay laughed, but there was sadness in it. Jake, I need you to understand what you'd be choosing. The compatibility bonding, it's not just attraction. Once it's fully established, we'll be neurochemically linked. You'll always be drawn back to me, no matter where your career takes you, and I'll be the same with you. That sounds terrifying. It is rather. Jake watched the play of light on the silver leaves around them, thinking about all the decisions that had led him to this moment. Can I tell you something? 3 months ago, I was convinced that my career was the most important thing in my life. I'd planned out the next 10 years, promotions, assignments, the whole trajectory mapped out like a military campaign. And now I realize I was planning a life that didn't include anyone I actually cared about. I was optimizing for advancement instead of happiness, and I didn't even notice the difference. He met her eyes. Lyrale, the neural enhancers didn't affect me yesterday, but they did teach me something. When everyone else was paranoid about conspiracies and hidden meanings, I was worried about one thing: making sure you were safe. That could just be the compatibility bonding, influencing your priorities. Or it could be that I've found someone worth changing my plans for. Jake reached out and took her hand, noting how perfectly it fit in his. Besides, if I'm going to be neurochemically linked to someone for the rest of my life, I can't think of anyone I'd rather it be than someone who makes me laugh, challenges my assumptions, and can hack into station systems just to help me fake an atmospheric report. You're sure about this? I'm sure that I want to find out what happens next, with you, here, or wherever we end up. Jake grinned. Though I have to admit, the idea of being Chief Morale Officer for sentient crystals is starting to sound appealing if it means I don't have to leave. Lyrale squeezed his hand. Jake, there's one more thing you should know about Valorian bonding customs. More biological complications. Worse, bureaucracy. Her expression was perfectly serious. If we formally acknowledge the bond, I'll need to file paperwork with both my cultural ministry and your military command. The forms alone will take months to process. Jake stared at her for a moment, then started laughing. You're telling me that after surviving alien plagues, neural enhancer contamination,